The gunshot still echoed in Victoria Clayton's ears as she clutched her sister's baby to her chest, her boots pounding against the dusty earth of the Colorado Territory. Spring of 1876 had brought more than wildflowers to the Clayton ranch. It had brought death, betrayal, and now desperate flight. The infant whimpered against her bodice, somehow sensing they were running for their lives. Victoria's lungs burned as she pushed through the underbrush, her once fine blue dress now torn and mudded. Behind her, she could hear the shouts of her brother-in-law's men. Gerald Blackman had murdered her sister Emily just 3 days prior, and Victoria had witnessed it all from the shadows of the barn. Now he wanted the baby and Victoria silenced forever. "There she is," a gruff voice called out, too close for comfort. Victoria ducked behind a large boulder, pressing her back against the cool stone. Little Alice, just 4 months old, squirmed in her arms. Victoria gently placed her hand over the baby's mouth, whispering soothing words though her own heart hammered wildly in her chest. "Please, sweet girl." "Just a little longer," she murmured, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. The sound of approaching horses made Victoria's blood run cold. Blackman's men were closing in. With the baby in her arms and nowhere to hide, Victoria knew she had moments at most before they would find her. Suddenly, a strong hand clamped over her mouth. Victoria tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. "Don't make a sound," a deep voice whispered in her ear. "Follow me if you want to live." The hand released her, and Victoria turned to face a tall, broad-shouldered man with intense hazel eyes. A cowboy, judging by his worn leather chaps and the dust-covered Stetson pulled low over his brow. He held a finger to his lips, then pointed to a narrow gap between 2 large rocks. "The baby," Victoria whispered, clutching Alice tighter. "Give her to me," the stranger said, his voice firm but gentle. "I can move faster." Victoria hesitated, but the approaching voices left her little choice. She carefully transferred the bundle to the stranger's arms. To her surprise, he handled the infant with practiced ease, tucking Alice securely against his chest. "This way," he said, leading Victoria through the gap and into a small hidden ravine where 2 horses waited, tethered to a scrubby pine. The stranger helped Victoria onto one of the horses before mounting his own, still holding Alice. They rode hard, keeping to the ravine until it opened into a wider valley. Victoria kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see Blackman's men in pursuit, but the cowboys' knowledge of the terrain seemed to have given them an edge. As the sun began to set, painting the Colorado sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they finally slowed their pace. The baby had fallen asleep against the stranger's chest, a miracle considering their breakneck pace. "Who are you?" Victoria finally asked, her voice hoarse from exertion and fear. The man adjusted his hat, revealing a handsome, weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh western sun. "Name's Henry Garrison. Most folks just call me Hank." "Victoria Clayton," she replied, then nodded toward the baby. "And that's Alice, my niece." Henry's expression darkened. "I know who you are, Miss Clayton, and I know you're running from Gerald Blackman." Victoria stiffened. "How do you?" "I worked your brother-in-law's ranch for 2 seasons before I couldn't stomach it anymore," Henry explained. "I was in town when I heard what happened to your sister. Wasn't hard to figure Blackman would come after the baby next, after you." Victoria's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He killed her, Emily. I saw it happen. He thought no one was watching, but I was in the barn. I heard them arguing about the baby. Emily told him Alice wasn't his child." Henry nodded grimly. "Blackman's pride wouldn't let that stand. I took Alice that night. We've been hiding in the hills for 3 days, but his men finally picked up our trail." Victoria's voice broke. "What am I going to do? Where can I go?" He owns half the county and has friends in all the wrong places." Henry was quiet for a long moment, watching the horizon as if searching for answers in the fading light. Finally, he turned to Victoria, his expression resolute. "You'll stay where no one can find you," he said firmly. "I have a place, far north near the Montana border. It belonged to my uncle. It's remote, difficult to find if you don't know it's there." "Why would you help me? You don't even know me," Victoria said, suspicion creeping into her voice despite her desperate circumstances. Henry's gaze was steady as he looked at her. "I knew your sister. She was kind to me when others weren't, and I've seen enough of Blackman's cruelty to last a lifetime." He glanced down at the sleeping infant. "Besides, no child deserves to be raised by a monster like him." As night fell, they made camp in a sheltered grove. Henry built a small fire and produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. Victoria was so hungry she barely tasted the tough, salty meat. While she ate, Henry cared for Alice, fashioning a makeshift cradle from his bedroll. Victoria watched him, curious about this taciturn cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere to rescue them. "You seem to know your way around babies," she observed. A shadow passed over Henry's face. "Had a younger sister, helped raise her after our ma died." "Where is she now?" Victoria asked. "Consumption took her 2 winters ago," he replied simply, but Victoria could hear the pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Henry nodded, accepting her condolence without comment. "We'll head out at first light. It's a 4-day ride to my place if the weather holds." Victoria looked down at her torn dress and muddy boots. "I'm not exactly prepared for a journey like that. There's a trading post about half a day's ride from here. The owner's wife might have some clothes to spare, and we'll need supplies for the baby." Victoria felt the weight of her empty pockets. "I don't have any money. I couldn't get to Emily's savings before I fled." Henry's expression softened slightly. "Don't worry about that. I've got enough to get us what we need." Despite her exhaustion, Victoria found sleep elusive that night. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every call of a night bird made her jerk awake, convinced Blackman's men had found them. She watched Henry, sleeping with one hand on his holstered revolver, the other resting protectively near Alice's makeshift cradle. Who was this man who had risked his own safety for strangers? Could she really trust him? As if sensing her scrutiny, Henry's eyes opened, meeting hers across the dying embers of their fire. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "We've got hard riding ahead." Victoria nodded, but she knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Not with the memory of her sister's murder still fresh and the uncertain future looming before her. Dawn broke cold and clear. They ate a sparse breakfast before packing up camp. Henry showed Victoria how to fashion a sling for Alice from a spare shirt, securing the baby against her chest for the ride ahead. "She'll be safer with you today," he explained. "I need both hands free in case we run into trouble." The morning passed without incident as they rode north, keeping to less traveled paths. Alice was surprisingly content, sleeping most of the time and waking only to fuss for feeding. Victoria had managed to bring a small supply of goat's milk for the baby, but it wouldn't last much longer. By midday, they reached the trading post. Henry had mentioned a rough-hewn log building with a small corral and smoke rising from the chimney. Henry dismounted, helping Victoria down before taking the baby so she could stretch her legs. "Wait here," he instructed, nodding toward a bench outside the trading post. "Best if you're not seen too much." Victoria sat, grateful for the rest, while Henry entered the building with Alice. Through the window, she could see him speaking with an older woman who nodded sympathetically when she saw the baby. After what felt like an eternity, Henry emerged with a bundle of supplies and a set of clothes draped over his arm. "Mrs. Turner is letting you use her back room to change, he said, handing Victoria the garments, a simple calico dress, woolen stockings, and sturdy boots that looked nearly new. She's also giving Alice a feeding while you get sorted. The back room was small but clean, with a wash basin that misses. Turner had filled with warm water. Victoria nearly wept at the simple luxury of washing the trail dust from her face and arms. The dress was a good fit, if a bit loose around the waist, and the boots were a vast improvement over her ruined ones. When she emerged, Mrs. Turner was rocking Alice in a creaking chair while Henry loaded their newly acquired supplies onto the horses. The older woman smiled kindly at Victoria. "Your husband says you're heading north to start fresh," she said, nodding toward Henry. "It's a hard journey with a little one, but you've got a good man there. I can see it in his eyes." Victoria opened her mouth to correct the misunderstanding but stopped herself. Perhaps it was safer if people believed they were a family. "Yes," she said instead. "We've been through some difficult times." Mrs. Turner patted her hand. "The West forges strong women. You'll manage just fine." She handed Alice back to Victoria. "I've wrapped up some dried apples and a loaf of fresh bread for your journey, and there's goat's milk in that flask for the little one." Victoria's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you. Your kindness means more than I can say." Once back on the trail, Victoria asked Henry about the supplies he'd purchased. "How much do I owe you? I'll find a way to repay you eventually." Henry shook his head. "Consider it a debt repaid. Your sister helped me once when I needed it." "How did you know Emily?" Victoria pressed, curious about the connection between her gentle sister and this rugged cowboy. Henry was quiet for so long Victoria thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I came to work for Blackman after a spell of bad luck. Lost my homestead to a fire, then got caught in a card game with a crooked dealer in Durango. Was nearly broke when Blackman hired me on." He adjusted his hat, shielding his eyes from the afternoon sun. "Your sister was already married to him by then. She saw right away that I was down on my luck. Started making sure I got extra food at mealtimes, mended my shirts when they tore. Small kindnesses, but they meant something to a man with nothing." Victoria's eyes stung with tears. That sounded exactly like Emily, always seeing the humanity in others, always extending compassion. "She talked about you sometimes," Henry continued. "Said her little sister was teaching school back east. She was real proud of you." Victoria's chest ached at the memory. "I came west when Emily's letters started sounding strange. She'd always been so happy in her correspondence, but something changed after she had Alice. I arrived at the ranch just a week ago." Her voice caught. "If I'd come sooner, maybe." "Don't," Henry cut her off firmly. "That kind of thinking leads nowhere good. Blackman fooled a lot of people with his respectable front. Nobody saw what he was capable of until it was too late." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Henry led them to a small creek where they made camp for the night. While Henry tended the horses, Victoria cared for Alice, marveling at how resilient the infant seemed despite their circumstances. "You're a strong one, just like your mama," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the baby's downy head. That night, as they sat by the fire, Victoria finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What made you leave Blackman's ranch? You said you couldn't stomach it anymore." Henry's jaw tightened. "Blackman has a temper. Most of the time he kept it in check around the men, but I saw how he was with your sister when he thought no one was looking. The way he'd grab her arm too tight, the threats he'd mutter under his breath." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying upward. "One night I heard them arguing. Next morning, Emily had bruises she tried to hide. I confronted Blackman about it." Henry's voice hardened. He made it clear that what happened between a man and his wife was his business alone. When I disagreed, I found myself looking down the barrel of his gun. Victoria gasped softly. He didn't pull the trigger, Henry continued, but he told me to get off his property by sundown or he would. I left, but I kept an eye on the place when I could. I was worried about Emily. You were right to be, Victoria said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. The next 3 days passed in a blur of endless riding, brief rest stops, and vigilant watchfulness. They saw no sign of pursuit, but Henry remained cautious, often doubling back or taking obscure trails to ensure they weren't being followed. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they moved north, the rolling foothills giving way to steeper mountains. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Henry led them up a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into a dense pine forest. After nearly an hour of navigating the tricky path, the trees suddenly opened to reveal a small valley nestled between towering peaks. A cabin stood near a swift-running stream with a barn and corral nearby. The setting sun bathed everything in a golden light that made the humble homestead look almost magical. "This is it," Henry said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Not much to look at, but it's solid. My uncle built it 20 years ago. Been empty since he passed last winter." Victoria took in the peaceful valley with wide eyes. After days of looking over her shoulder, the isolated location felt like a sanctuary. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Henry's mouth curved in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. "Thought you might like it. Come on, let's get you and the little one settled." The cabin was small but well built, with 2 rooms separated by a partial wall. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furnishings, a table, chairs, a bed, and a chest filled the main room. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust. "It needs some cleaning," Henry acknowledged, setting their supplies on the table. "But the roof doesn't leak, and the chimney draws well. There's a root cellar out back with some preserved goods, and the stream has good fishing." Victoria stood in the center of the room, Alice sleeping against her chest, and felt the first real stirrings of hope since Emily's death. "We'll be safe here," Henry nodded. "Blackman doesn't know about this place, and even if he somehow tracked us this far, the approach is easy to defend." He gestured toward the single trail they'd ascended. "Nobody comes up that path without being seen." As Henry went to tend to the horses, Victoria began the process of making the cabin habitable. She found a broom in the corner and swept away the dust and cobwebs, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and shook out the bedding that had been stored in the chest. By the time Henry returned with their belongings, she had cleared enough space to lay out a pallet for Alice. "You take the bed," Henry said, nodding toward the simple frame along the far wall. "I'll sleep by the fire." Victoria wanted to protest, to insist he take the bed he'd rightfully earned through his kindness, but exhaustion was overtaking her. "Just for tonight," she conceded. "We'll figure out something more fair tomorrow." That night, despite her bone-deep weariness, Victoria lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of wind through the pines, the soft breathing of Alice beside her, and the occasional shifting of Henry as he slept near the dying embers of the fire. For the first time since fleeing the ranch, Victoria allowed herself to feel the full weight of her grief for Emily, silently weeping into the rough spun pillow until sleep finally claimed her. The morning brought a new routine. Henry rose early to hunt, returning with a brace of rabbits that Victoria prepared for their breakfast. After eating, he showed her the root cellar, which contained enough preserved vegetables, dried beans, and flour to last them several weeks. "Uncle Joseph was always prepared for winter," Henry explained as they inventoried the stores. Never knew when a snowstorm might cut off the trail for weeks at a time. What did he do up here all alone? Victoria asked, curious about the man who had built this isolated haven. Trapped in the winter, panned for gold in the summer. Wasn't a sociable man, my uncle, but he knew how to survive. Henry pulled out a dusty jar of preserved peaches. He came west after the war, the one between the states, said he'd seen enough of people to last him a lifetime. Victoria nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well after her recent experiences. The days began to take on a pattern. Henry would hunt or fish in the mornings while Victoria tended to Alice and the cabin. In the afternoons, they would work together on necessary repairs, fixing a loose shutter, reinforcing the corral fence, clearing the overgrown garden plot. At first, they moved around each other awkwardly, two strangers thrust together by circumstance. But gradually, a cautious camaraderie developed. Victoria found herself watching Henry when he didn't notice, observing the gentle way he handled Alice, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. For his part, Henry seemed to grow more at ease in Victoria's presence. His taciturn nature slowly gave way to occasional stories about his life before growing up in Kansas, the sister he'd lost, his dreams of having his own cattle someday. Victoria shared her own history in return, her childhood in Missouri, her time teaching in a small school in Pennsylvania, the letters from Emily that had drawn her west. A week after their arrival, Victoria was hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines when she saw a rider approaching on the trail below. Her heart leaped into her throat. Henry. She called urgently, snatching Alice from her basket and hurrying toward the cabin where Henry was repairing a chair. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Get inside. Stay away from the windows," he instructed, his voice calm but tense. Victoria clutched Alice to her chest and retreated into the cabin, her pulse pounding in her ears. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched as Henry positioned himself near the edge of the clearing, rifle ready. The rider came into view, an older man with a gray beard, leading a packhorse laden with supplies. He raised a hand in greeting when he spotted Henry. "Joseph Garrison's nephew, ain't you?" the man called out as he approached. "Thought I might find someone up here when I saw smoke from the chimney." Henry lowered his rifle slightly but remained wary. "Who's asking?" "Name's Martin. Trading post down in Willow Creek. Used to do business with your uncle." The older man dismounted stiffly. "Heard he passed. Was making my spring rounds and thought I'd check if anyone had taken over the place." Henry relaxed visibly. "Appreciate the concern, Mr. Martin. I've been here about a week now." Martin nodded, his eyes drifting toward the cabin. "Noticed some women's things on that washing line. You got family up here with you?" Victoria held her breath, waiting for Henry's response. "My wife and daughter," Henry said smoothly. "Victoria and Alice. We're making a fresh start after some trouble back in Colorado." Victoria's cheeks warmed at the ease with which Henry claimed them as his family. It was a necessary deception, she reminded herself. "Mighty remote place to bring a family," Martin commented, though there was no suspicion in his voice. "But I suppose that's the appeal for some. Your uncle always said this valley was the closest thing to paradise he'd found." Henry nodded. That was Uncle Joseph's way of thinking. "We're coming around to it." Martin glanced at the packhorse. "Got supplies if you're interested. Flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition. Some yard goods the missus might like." "We could use some supplies," Henry agreed. "Victoria," he called toward the cabin, "it's all right. Come meet Mr. Martin." Victoria hesitated, then stepped outside with Alice, forcing a smile that she hoped appeared natural. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Martin." The trader tipped his hat. "Madam, beautiful child you have there." "Thank you," Victoria replied, the lie sticking in her throat even as she recognized its necessity. Martin stayed for an hour, trading goods for some of the pelts Joseph had left in the barn. He shared news of the outside world: a new mining strike 50 miles east, trouble with cattle rustlers to the south, a stage-coach line being extended to Willow Creek by summer's end. "I make this route every few months," Martin said as he prepared to leave. "Be back through by late July if you need anything special ordered." After the trader departed, Victoria and Henry stood side by side, watching until he disappeared down the trail. "You think he suspected anything?" Victoria asked anxiously. Henry shook his head. "Martin's been trading in these mountains for 20 years. He minds his own business, but we should be prepared in case word gets back to Blackman somehow." Victoria shuddered at the thought. "What do? We keep our eyes open, and I'll teach you to shoot." Henry nodded toward the rifle he'd set aside. "Just in case." That afternoon, Henry gave Victoria her first lesson in handling firearms. She'd never touched a gun before, and the weight of the rifle felt strange and dangerous in her hands. "You're holding it too stiffly," Henry said, adjusting her grip. "Relax your shoulders. Breathe easy." He stood close behind her, his hands guiding hers on the weapon. Victoria was acutely aware of his nearness, the warmth of his breath near her ear as he spoke. Something fluttered in her chest that had nothing to do with fear of the gun. "Sight along the barrel," he instructed. "Take your time. When you're ready, squeeze the trigger gently, don't pull it." Victoria focused on the target Henry had set up and placed on a stump 50 yards away. She drew a steady breath, aligned the sights, and squeezed. The rifle's report echoed through the valley, and the Ken jumped as her bullet struck home. "Good." Henry's voice held genuine approval. "You're a natural, Victoria." She lowered the rifle, surprised at the rush of pride she felt. "I hit it." "You did," he confirmed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a rare smile. "A few more sessions like this, and you'll be handling that rifle like you were born to it." As the days turned to weeks, Victoria's skill with the rifle improved, as did her confidence in their new life. The cabin began to feel less like a hideout and more like a home. She'd used the yard goods from Martin to sew curtains for the windows and a proper bed for Alice, who was growing stronger and more alert by the day. Henry expanded the garden, planting potatoes, carrots, and beans in the rich mountain soil. He fashioned a cradle for Alice from pine boards, carving small woodland animals along the edges that delighted Victoria with their detail. "I didn't know you were an artist," she said, running her fingers over the carvings. Henry ducked his head, almost bashful. "Just something to pass the time in winter. My father taught me." "They're beautiful, Henry. Alice will cherish them when she's older." Something flickered in Henry's eyes at that, a shadow of doubt or worry. But it was gone before Victoria could identify it. One evening in early June, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold, Victoria found herself studying Henry's profile. The harsh lines of his face had softened somewhat in their weeks together, though a watchfulness remained in his eyes that spoke of a man accustomed to hardship. "What will you do when this is over?" she asked suddenly. "When Blackman is no longer a threat?" Henry looked surprised by the question. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted after a moment. "Get back to my plans for a cattle operation, I suppose, if I can save enough to buy some decent land." Victoria nodded, trying to ignore the pang she felt at the thought of Henry returning to his own life, a life that didn't include her or Alice. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for us," she said quietly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Henry turned to face her fully. "There's nothing to repay, Victoria. I didn't help you expecting anything in return." "I know," she said. That's what makes your kindness so remarkable." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, Victoria thought he might say more, might reach for her hand. Instead, he stood abruptly. "It's getting dark. We should head in." The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was ready to voice. As June gave way to July, the mountain valley bloomed with wildflowers and the garden flourished under their care. Alice began to crawl, exploring the cabin with determined curiosity that kept Victoria constantly vigilant. "She's got her mother's spirit," Henry observed one afternoon as Alice determinedly pulled herself up on a chair, her little face scrunched in concentration. Victoria felt a pang of sadness. "I wish Emily could see her. She would be so proud of how strong Alice is growing." Henry's expression softened. "She can see her," he said simply. "And she knows her daughter is safe and loved." Victoria's eyes welled with tears at his words. Without thinking, she reached out and took Henry's hand in hers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." His fingers tightened around hers, the calloused palm warm against her skin. For a long moment, they stood like that, connected by their shared concern for Alice, and something deeper neither had yet named. The peaceful rhythm of their days was shattered one morning in late July. Victoria was kneading dough for bread while Henry chopped wood outside when she heard the distant sound of multiple horses approaching. Henry burst through the door, his face grim. "Riders coming, at least 3, maybe more." Victoria's blood ran cold. "Blackman? Can't tell yet. But we need to be prepared." He retrieved his rifle and handed Victoria the revolver he'd been teaching her to use. "Take Alice and hide in the root cellar. Don't come out unless I call for you." "What about you?" Victoria's voice trembled. "I'll meet them, see what they want." His eyes met hers, conveying what he couldn't say aloud, that he would defend them with his life if necessary. Victoria gathered Alice and a blanket, her heart pounding. "Be careful, Henry." He nodded, his expression softening for just a moment. "Remember what I taught you. If anything happens to me, take the North Trail. It leads to a hunting cabin about 5 miles up. You'll be safe there until you can make it to Willow Creek." Victoria wanted to protest, to insist they flee together, but there wasn't time. She hurried to the root cellar, closing the heavy wooden door behind her and nestling Alice in a corner amid sacks of potatoes. The baby, sensing her mother's tension, began to whimper. "Shh, sweet girl," Victoria whispered, rocking Alice gently. "We must be very quiet now." Through the small ventilation gaps in the cellar door, Victoria could see Henry standing on the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The riders came into view, 4 men, dust-covered and grim-faced. Victoria's heart nearly stopped when she recognized the lead rider, Gerald Blackman himself. "Garrison," Blackman called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Been a long time." "Blackman." Henry's stance remained relaxed, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. "What brings you to these parts?" Blackman dismounted, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the ground. He was a tall man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth partly hidden beneath a well-groomed mustache. "Funny thing. Trader passing through Durango mentioned seeing my late wife's sister up in the mountains, with a baby." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Said she was living with some cowboy who claimed to be Joseph Garrison's nephew." Henry didn't flinch. "Don't know what you're talking about, Blackman. I live here alone." Blackman's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the cabin. Victoria could see washing hanging on the line, including one of her dresses and some of Alice's small garments. There was no hiding the evidence of their presence. "You always were a poor liar, Garrison." Blackman nodded to his men, who spread out, hands hovering near their holstered guns. "Where are they?" "Gone," Henry replied evenly. "Took them to the railroad at Willow Creek yesterday. They'll be halfway to California by now." Victoria held her breath, pressing Alice closer to muffle her small sounds. Blackman laughed harshly. "You expect me to believe that? After you've gone to such trouble to hide them?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "That baby is mine, Garrison. My blood, my heir." Henry's voice was cold as steel. "We both know that's not true, Blackman. Emily told you Alice wasn't yours before you killed her." A flash of fury crossed Blackman's face. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. Victoria saw you murder her sister, and I know why." Henry's gaze was steady. "Emily found out what you did to that young Ute woman 2 years ago. The one who went missing after working at your ranch. She threatened to go to the authorities." Blackman's hand moved to his gun. "That's a dangerous accusation, Garrison." "It's the truth. Emily wrote it all down in a letter before she died. Victoria has it now, safely delivered to a lawyer in Denver." Henry's bluff was delivered with such conviction that even Victoria almost believed it. "If anything happens to either of them, or to me, that letter goes to the territorial governor." Uncertainty flickered across Blackman's face. "You're lying." "Am I?" Henry challenged. "You willing to bet your neck on that? Because they hang men for murdering Indian women in Colorado these days, especially men who have already killed their wives." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Victoria clutched the revolver, her knuckles white, ready to defend Alice if Blackman's men discovered their hiding place. Finally, Blackman spoke, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "This isn't over, Garrison. Not by a long shot." "It is over," Henry countered. "Go back to your ranch, Blackman. Forget about Victoria and the baby. They're no threat to you as long as you leave them be." Blackman's jaw clenched visibly. "You've made a powerful enemy today." "Wouldn't be the first time," Henry replied calmly. With a curt nod to his men, Blackman mounted his horse. "We'll be watching the trail to Willow Creek," he said, a final threat. "If they show their faces, they're mine." Henry remained on the porch, rifle ready, as the riders departed down the narrow trail. Only when they were well out of sight did he hurry to the root cellar, pulling open the heavy door. "Victoria," he called softly. "It's safe now." She emerged, shaking with relief and residual fear. Alice clutched tight against her. Henry enfolded them both in his arms, and Victoria pressed her face against his chest, inhaling the comforting scent of pine and leather. "Is he gone?" she whispered. "For now," Henry replied, his voice vibrating through his chest against her ear. "But he'll be back. Or he'll have men watching for us." He drew back slightly, looking down at her with concern. "Are you all right?" Victoria nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. "What do we do now?" Henry guided her to the cabin, his arm supporting her. "We need to leave, tonight. Blackman will have men watching the main trail, but there's another way down the mountain. It's rougher terrain, but it will take us northwest, away from Blackman's territory." "Where will we go?" Victoria asked, setting Alice on the bed. "I have a friend in Montana Territory. Owns a ranch near Virginia City. He'll give us shelter while we figure out our next move." Henry began gathering supplies, his movements quick and efficient. "Pack only what we need for the journey. We'll travel light and fast." As Victoria prepared for their flight, a strange calm settled over her. They had faced Blackman and survived. Whatever came next, they would face it together. By nightfall, they were ready. Henry had loaded their essential supplies onto one horse, leaving the other for Victoria and Alice. Before mounting up, he paused, looking back at the cabin that had been their sanctuary. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I thought you'd be safe here." Victoria touched his arm gently. "You couldn't have known he would find us. You've done more for us than anyone had a right to expect, Henry." He covered her hand with his own, his eyes meeting hers in the gathering darkness. "I'd do it all again," he said simply. They rode through the night, Henry leading them along a barely visible trail that wound through dense forest and across rocky ridges. Alice, securely bundled against Victoria's chest, slept remarkably well despite the difficult journey. Dawn found them high on a mountain pass, looking down at the vast expanse of wilderness stretching toward the Montana border. They paused to rest the horses and eat a cold breakfast of jerky and hardtack. "How much farther?" Victoria asked, massaging her sore legs while Henry changed Alice's wrappings. "2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turns," he replied, gently laying Alice on a blanket. "The border's about 30 miles north. Once we cross it, we'll be out of Blackman's reach. He has no influence in Montana territory." Victoria nodded, watching as Henry tenderly tucked the blanket around Alice. Something about seeing this strong, capable man so gentle with a child stirred emotions she had been trying to suppress. "Henry," she began hesitantly, "after we reach your friend's ranch, what then?" He looked up, his expression unreadable in the early morning light. "That depends on what you want, Victoria." "What I want?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes." He moved to sit beside her on a fallen log. "All this time we've been running, surviving. We haven't talked about what happens when we're truly safe." Victoria stared down at her hands, suddenly unsure. "I don't know. I've been so focused on keeping Alice safe that I haven't thought beyond that." Henry was quiet for a moment. "You could go back east, I suppose. Start over somewhere Blackman would never think to look." The thought of returning east alone with Alice filled Victoria with unexpected dread. "Is that what you think I should do?" "I think," Henry said carefully, "that you should do whatever brings you peace. You and Alice both deserve that after everything you've endured." Victoria gathered her courage and asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. "And what about you? What brings you peace, Henry?" His gaze met hers, intense and honest. "I think you know the answer to that, Victoria," her breath caught. "Tell me anyway." Henry reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. "These past weeks watching you with Alice, seeing how strong and brave you are, how you've made a home out of a hiding place, it's changed something in me." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "I never expected to find a family when I rode out to help Emily's sister. But that's what's happened, isn't it?" Tears welled in Victoria's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly what's happened." Emboldened by her response, Henry continued, "I want you and Alice to stay with me. Not because you need protection, but because I've come to care for you both more than I thought possible." His voice grew rough with emotion. "I love you, Victoria, and I love that little girl as if she were my own." Victoria's heart soared at his words. She had known for weeks that her feelings for Henry had grown beyond gratitude, but hearing him express his own emotions so plainly broke down the last of her reservations. "I love you too, Henry," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "And Alice adores you. We both do." Henry's face transformed with a smile that erased years of hardship from his features. Slowly, giving her time to object, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a tender kiss that held both promise and reverence. When they parted, Victoria rested her forehead against his. "So we stay together," she said, no longer a question. "We stay together," Henry confirmed, his arms encircling her. "And we build something new, somewhere Blackman can never touch us." Alice chose that moment to wake, her happy gurgle making them both laugh. Henry reached for her, lifting her into his arms with practiced ease. "What do you think, little one? Ready for a new adventure with your ma and pa?" Victoria's heart swelled at the sight of them together. At the natural way, Henry had claimed the role of father to Emily's daughter. In the midst of loss and danger, They had found something precious, a family forged by choice rather than blood. They reached Henry's friend's ranch 2 days later, tired but hopeful. Samuel Wilson, a burly rancher with a booming laugh and kind eyes, welcomed them with open arms, offering them use of a small homestead cabin on his property for as long as they needed. "Any friend of Henry's is a friend of mine," he declared, clapping Henry on the shoulder. "And any enemy of his is welcome to answer to my shotgun." The cabin was smaller than the one they'd left behind in Colorado, but it was snug and solid. With Samuel's help, Henry quickly made it habitable, adding a lean-to kitchen and reinforcing the roof before the first autumn rains. Victoria planted a garden and learned to preserve the summer's bounty for the coming winter. Alice took her first tottering steps across the cabin floor in late August, her little face alight with triumph as she wobbled from Victoria's arms to Henry's waiting hands. In September, with wildflowers still blooming in the meadows surrounding the cabin, Henry and Victoria were married by a traveling preacher. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, Alice, Samuel, and a few neighboring ranchers who had become friends. Victoria wore a blue dress that Mrs. Wilson had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair. When Henry saw her walking toward him across the meadow, Alice on her hip, the look of wonder on his face was worth every hardship they had endured to reach this moment. "I take you, Victoria, to be my wife," Henry said, his voice strong and clear as they stood before the preacher. "I promise to protect you and Alice with everything I have, to cherish you both all the days of my life, and to build a home filled with love and laughter where no shadows from the past can reach us." Victoria's eyes shimmered with tears as she responded, "I take you, Henry, to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to raise Alice with stories of her mother's courage, and to fill our days together with the joy and peace we've fought so hard to find." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Henry gathered both Victoria and Alice into his embrace. "My family," he murmured against Victoria's hair. "My heart." That winter was harsh but happy. Snow piled high around the cabin, but inside was warm with love and newfound security. Henry trapped and hunted, ensuring they had meat through the coldest months. Victoria sewed and cooked, transforming their small dwelling into a true home. Alice grew stronger each day, her first words "Ma" and "Pa" filling them both with indescribable joy. News reached them in early spring that Gerald Blackman had been arrested for the murder of a business rival in Denver. The evidence was overwhelming, and he faced the gallows. Though they remained cautious, the knowledge that their greatest threat was behind bars allowed Victoria and Henry to begin planning their future more openly. With money saved from Henry's trapping and Victoria's sale of her preserved goods to miners in Virginia City, they purchased a small parcel of land bordering Samuel's ranch. Henry's dream of raising cattle began to take shape as they acquired their first small herd, just 10 head, but a start. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch of their new home watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Alice playing with wooden blocks at their feet, Henry took Victoria's hand in his. "Happy?" he asked simply. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, her free hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child, a son, she somehow knew was growing. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. "When I fled the ranch with Alice in my arms that day, I thought our lives were ending. I never imagined we were just beginning." Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You know, when I told you that you'd stay where no one could find you, this isn't exactly what I had in mind." Victoria laughed softly. "No, no," he admitted. "I was thinking of a hiding place, not a home, of safety, not happiness." His hand covered hers over her belly. I never thought I'd find both in the same place." As twilight settled over the valley, Alice crawled into Henry's lap, her small face a perfect blend of Emily's features and a spirit uniquely her own. She reached out to touch Victoria's cheek, a gesture of pure trust and love. "Story, Mama?" she asked, her voice sweet in the gathering dusk. Victoria smiled, catching Henry's gaze over their daughter's head. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a brave young woman who fled a ranch with a baby in her arms, not knowing where to turn or who to trust." Henry's eyes shone with love as he joined in. "And a cowboy who promised she would stay where no one could find her, never imagining he was really leading her home." In the distance, a lone wolf howled, not a threat, but a reminder of the wilderness that had sheltered them, the vast landscape that had given them room to build a new life far from the shadows of the past. Victoria listened to its cry and felt, for the first time since Emily's death, a sense of perfect peace. Their story, begun in fear and flight, had transformed into one of love and redemption. Whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together, a family forged in the crucible of the untamed West, stronger for all they had overcome. As night fell completely, Henry carried a sleeping Alice inside while Victoria remained a moment longer on the porch, gazing up at the vast canopy of stars. Somewhere, she liked to think, Emily was watching over them, approving of the family her daughter had found, the love that had blossomed from tragedy. "Thank you," Victoria whispered to the night sky, for her sister, for Henry, for the second chance none of them had expected but all of them had earned. Then she turned and went inside, closing the door on the wilderness beyond. Embracing the warmth of the home, they had created a place where they were not hiding but truly living, not running but standing firm together.